Welcome to the kind of annual Academy of Social Sciences lecture, which is given tonight by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, uh, a kind of an economist I very much admire and proud to call her a friend. Um, she's got multiple uh, multiple things to her of in her biography, not least of which um, was Pope Francis just before um, he died, appointing her to the Pontifical Academy for Life because she brought more humanity to the world. But in the course of providing that humanity, she's Professor of Economics of Innovation and Public Value at the University College London. She's the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's won multiple awards. Uh, One I'm going to try and pronounce in Italian, the Grande Ufficiale Rodine al Merito della Repubblica Italiana, which is the biggest honor you can get in Italy for the promotion of and the creation of kind of public value, a higher civilian honor. Her books have, she's a great author, and there's another one in the offing, but she kicks the she opened her account with the entrepreneurial state, uh, really making the case that actually uh, the government, more than markets, was the originator of really transformative innovation, the value of everything, the mission economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, which really caught the eye of policymakers and governments around the world, actually. And more recently, the big con, how the consulting industry weakens our businesses, infantilizes our government, and warps our economies. Um, she advises many governments, not only in kind of the OECD, but actually kind of in the global south. At the moment, she's alongside the president of South Africa, who's hosting the G20 summits kind of this year, advising him on the best way to go forward. So it's a great privilege, actually, to have her giving this lecture, which is on mission-oriented growth, taking it seriously, advice for the UK government. Marianne, I don't think there's much more you need from me. I've already occupied 2 minutes. It's a short I hope that's built you up. We're all salivating for more. I'll hand over to you straight away.
Thanks, Will. I still remember back in 2011, I think it was, when I was writing the pamphlet version of what became the 2013 book. You and I had lunch together, and we talked about the lessons from the entrepreneurial state for the government at the time. And now, fast forward, we're still here. So let me just share my screen. This is usually the hardest part when you risk sharing pictures of yourself. Here we go. Hold on. There we go. Fantastic. So I will speak about 30 minutes. I'm really excited also about the discussion. So I'll keep to 30. And what I'd like to talk about is some of the implications from, back in the days of the entrepreneurial state, but especially around mission economy for a government, the UK government, a progressive government that talks about missions, and how to make sure, I always say to any government, that missions become a provocation for change and not mission washing. So old wine in new bottles. And what can we learn from attempts at this around the world? And it's always going to be an attempt. This is about experimentation, learning by doing. That's why I also really believe in state capacity. I set up an institute at University College London. It's actually a department, so we have our own curriculum about rethinking the state. And if anyone listening is interested, we have our annual forum called Rethinking the State on June 19th and 20th. And just look at the IAPP website for more information on that. So what does it mean to take mission-oriented government seriously? Well, first of all, we're lucky that the current Prime Minister of the UK isn't just talking about growth for growth's sake. Anytime we talk about missions, it's actually a discussion about the direction of growth. But that's only if and only if, missions go to the center and don't remain somewhere far away in the periphery. What I mean by the center of how we understand the economy, the center of how we understand finance. And I'll talk to you soon about what it actually means to do that in terms of interministerial coordination around missions. But what happens when governments don't have missions is that they start, confusing, if you want, economic growth with the mission itself. If we just talk about growth for growth's sake, that's not what I at least mean by mission orientation. Missions have the opportunity, if done right, and that's what I'll be talking about, to catalyze a wave of public and private sector investment. And the fact that in this country, the UK, we remain very low in terms of business investment. I think we're currently 28th in the OECD in terms of business investment. There's a real opportunity to use missions to drive public and private sector investment around goals, around health, the digital divide, around net zero, maybe water-related missions, given that we have sewage in our waters. But growth is not the mission. Growth is the result if we get missions right. And so, when we confuse that, when we confuse missions with growth, we also end up with this like false dichotomy between the what's to be done, like climate change, solving those problems, whether we call it net zero, climate, biodiversity, water, these are all interrelated in terms of the climate crisis. We confuse the what's to be done with growth and then end up thinking that we have to choose one or the other. And I fear that that's sort of starting to happen in the UK, where the way we're talking about the economy, the way that we've set up the fiscal rules, I'm sure we'll get back to that later, is actually impeding our ability to have mission accomplished, right? Because what missions should do is that we have the goals and then we ask ourselves, what does it mean for all the different economic tools? What does it mean for procurement? What does it mean for the structure of how we do budgeting? What does it mean for public banks, if we have them? What does it mean for public-private partnerships? And so this tension that sometimes we have in different countries, for example, in Germany, where the government actually fell, I would argue, because of this, comes from this kind of a lack of understanding, I would argue, about that the best way to actually drive growth is by having some objectives that we need to reach, which then require public and private sector investment. And if we do that properly, we end up expanding productive capacity. If we can stimulate public investment, which crowds in private sector investment, ultimately that's the denominator of debt to GDP. So if we get missions right, again, the subject of my talk today, we can actually, if you want, do both, kind of, solve the growth problem, but especially the directed growth problem, and solve all sorts of problems that we have in society along the way. Again, health issues, climate issues, and so on. So that's really what I want to talk about. But to do that, before we talk about missions, I often begin my talks with just recognizing, that we need to go really deep first. Missions in some ways are really important for designing smart policy, but first we need to admit what the problems are. And, just quickly, in the UK, we still have a financial sector which is ultra-financialized. Something like 80% of finance in the UK goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. So, getting finance to get reinvested into the economy and help steer that economy to be more driven by innovation, be more inclusive, be more sustainable is a huge challenge. Second, we still have actually many businesses which might have high profits but low investment. We've seen that in recent days with companies like Thames Water. We've seen that also with Carillion. We have a corporate governance structure that is prioritizing short-term shareholder returns and not long-term investment. That's not true for all companies, but this is a trend in many Anglo-Saxon types of economies in terms of Anglo-Saxon capitalism, I would argue. Both Will and I have talked about varieties of capitalism, but we need to recognize anytime we talk about the need for public-private partnerships, it's also about new governance mechanisms within both the public and the private. Indeed, the public itself, I think, has been misgoverned historically by, at worst, you're just taking up space, get out of the way. But really, that's not the conversation today. The conversation today is what I would argue at worst, at best, you're there to fix a market failure. So we end up with patchy policies. That's why I have a Band-Aid there. If you're just there in a public institution to fix a market failure, it's not a coincidence. It's by design that we end up having policies that are kind of too little, too late, and designed to actually just fill the gap. That's why we often at the global level talk about financial gaps for areas like climate change or the Sustainable Development Goals, because if the policy itself is designed to fix a market failure, to fill the gap of something the private sector is not doing, then even a concept like public goods ends up actually not really being a theory of the public, but a theory of what the private is not doing, right? Due to, say, positive externalities, where you don't have enough private sector investment in something because of non-excludable, non-rival characteristics, we expect the government to fill that gap, whether it's basic research or clean water or defense systems. The opposite would be a negative externality in market failure theory, where you have too much investment in something that creates a bad. We expect government to come in and fix that through, say, a carbon tax. And you could kind of go down the different areas of policy, and you see them as fixing different types of failures, whether it's a market failure, a system failure, or coordination failure. And it's not that these market failures don't exist, is that if the framing itself, the design of the policy, is about fixing, facilitating, enabling, the word I hate the most is de-risking, then it's not surprising that we don't get bold, ambitious, and what I will soon call mission-oriented policies or mission-oriented government that's able to really take on risks, welcome uncertainty, share risks, share rewards. If you're just enabling, it's not surprising then that it becomes much more interesting for young graduates to go work with the risk takers and not the de-riskers, the ones who play in the battlefield instead of just enable those who are playing. So a lot of the vocabulary that we actually have used to describe what the public sector is for really needs to change. And not a lender of last resort, but an investor of first resort, not a market fixer, but a market shaper. And this is very much the work that I've been kind of writing about for the last, many years, from the entrepreneurial. Hey, put yourself on mute before. Just kidding. From the entrepreneurial state to the value of everything to mission economy to the last book, The Big Con, written with my PhD student, Rosie Collington, where we really called out the alarm that a lot of what I'll be talking about today is actually impossible with weak government. Really interesting to compare that to what's been happening in the US under Elon Musk's Doge. Can't even pronounce that, Doge. He's apparently out, but Doge is not out, which is really, for me, just the icing on the cake of 50 years of weakening of government capacity through this kind of outsourcification, consultification. And in that book, we look at, we don't just look at the facts around consulting. 1.5 million a day is what the UK government spent on Deloitte for test and trace, where they failed miserably during COVID, but just the why. Why has this massive door been open to the consultants in governments globally, the UK government being one of the prime examples, due to, in fact, this weakening, but also fear of risk-taking in government units. So all these processes of rethinking the state as part of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, part of a wealth creation, not just redistributive, not just enabling, not just facilitating, another word I don't like, and the underlying theory of value that needs to underlie that. If we think of collective value creation, mission economy in terms of the design of policies, I'll come back to that in a minute, but also the strengthening of state capacity. My new book, by the way, which I'm in theory writing, but a bit hard because I've also been working a bit too much with different governments. I just got back yesterday from Mexico, is actually about how underlying all of this, we need a new theory of good. Right? So a proper theory of the common good that goes beyond the public good as a correction, but the common good as an objective, where the how matters as much as the what. I've gotten quite a bit of inspiration from philosophers, from Aristotle onwards, who always thought of the telos and the polis at the same time. They were not, just goal-oriented or just the how. The two things went hand in hand, and I believe a proper theory of the common good requires that as well, and that's what I'm trying to develop. But what I'd like to talk about today, some lessons for the UK government, as the title of the talk goes, in terms of what we've learned in the Institute by actually trying to implement kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems where the state institutions are key actors, and this idea of mission and outcomes orientation. What does it mean for policy design to go from fixing to co-creating? What does it mean for institutions like public banks or tools like public sector procurement to be truly outcomes oriented? What does it mean for much more dynamic, symbiotic, and not parasitic public-private partnership in terms of a new social contract? How do we get people involved in this? So partly also to make sure that we build trust. There's so much distrust globally, not just in the UK, in terms of the political process. So true co-creation and participatory processes. I can already warn you, have too much time to speak about that, but I do recognize it's incredibly important, and we economists have lots to learn by working with others on that. It's not an area of expertise, but it's very important. And this issue of dynamic capabilities. How do we strengthen our ability to not only co-create, but really to govern really complicated processes, characterized by feedback effects and processes that require a lot of different actors working together. Okay, so the first is, what do we actually even mean by mission-driven policy design to make sure that we don't have what I mentioned before, old wine in new bottles. Well, the reason I wrote Mission Economy is that I don't think we would have gotten to the moon had we, or if we, speak like we speak today about this whole idea that one side facilitates the other. It's not surprising that Kennedy said we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy, right? Doing something because it's hard is not facilitating it. Facilitating in Italian and Latin means making something easier. It's exactly the opposite of doing something, welcoming the uncertainty, doing it because it's hard, embracing uncertainty together. And it's not surprising that the first thing that NASA did in order to undertake such a complex process was to change the tools. So to change, for example, how procurement was actually structured from being from being cost plus to being fixed price, challenge oriented, with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. They literally realized that in order to stimulate this huge amount of public and private interaction, 400,000 people is what it took to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. They had to solve problems together. And that meant that the tools had to be problem oriented. And what was super interesting was that NASA then went about that with lots of different companies. I'll get to that in a minute. But they were confident about their own role. So they even put into the contracts, and everything's legal in the end, whether it's a patent, it's a legal contract, procurement is a legal contract. They put into the contract no excess profits, not no profits, no excess profits. In other words, if we're going to really do this together, we're not going to turn this into gambling casino. So that idea of also fairness, not due to some sort of high-level moral, but if we're going to collectively create value, let's socialize both risks and rewards and not allow excess gains, which of course, again, something we might get to in the Q&A period when we look at AI companies today, these huge amounts of wealth that have been accrued in few companies out of ultimately what was a collective value creation process. But it was due to this outcomes orientation and mission orientation and not confusing outcomes with outputs that we got all these innovations along the way. Even if they had literally exploded just before getting to the moon, you could have still called this mission successful in terms of what happened along the way. Because they were solving problems together, it wasn't about being business friendly, a term I absolutely do not like. It was about working well together to get the job done in different areas. And just like, going to the moon was not just aerospace, it was as much solving how would the astronauts eat, how would they go to the bathroom, what would they wear, literally the material. Solving the climate problem today is obviously not just about energy. It's how do we build, how do we move, sustainable mobility, what do we wear, so on and so forth. So the solutions to all these problems got us innovations, not because they were obsessing about technology or innovations, but they were obsessing about the problems at hand. And that's what got us camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula. And these were solutions to problems. So this problem orientation. This is a message I also put through in the entrepreneurial state when I held up the iPhone and said, if you don't like my message, throw your smartphone out, because all the technologies that actually make those phones smart and not stupid were not only publicly financed, but financed through public agencies that were worried about problems. So the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, all publicly financed, but with a question in mind. The internet, what was the question? How would the satellites communicate? GPS, what was the question? Where are all the ships in the ocean? So the more we can formulate really bold and interesting problems, the more then we require public and private actors to work together to solve those problems. And so you already see where I'm going. As I mentioned, similarly with any big problem we have today, how do we actually design a mission that addresses that challenge? Challenges are quite wide. They're like the SDGs, right? No poverty, zero hunger, but turning those wide challenges, important, bold challenges. Don't forget the SDGs, we all have signed up to them, but we're going backwards, but turning them into missions that are as concrete as getting to the moon and back again in a short amount of time. And what do I mean by concrete? Simply that you can answer yes or no. Did you achieve it? Yes or no? Did you get to the moon and back in a short amount of time? Notwithstanding the conspiracy theories. But the key point here is to make sure that the missions are intersectoral. So going to the moon and back required, as I said, nutrition, materials, electronics, software to invest and innovate. And this becomes really important. We know that old school industrial strategies that were just picking winners, picking sectors to support, basically just to stay in place, had problems, right? Because it was very easy to capture one sector, two sectors, three sectors that consider themselves or lobby their way up to be considered strategic sectors. So missions, if designed well, and yes, this is a biased view, this is what I mean by missions, not everyone means this by missions, require intersectoral, economy-wide transformation. I'll give you more examples in a minute. And then it requires, as I already mentioned in the case of the procurement, the tools to be redesigned to stimulate and catalyze bottom-up, not top-down, innovation towards mission accomplished. And those were all those dynamic spillovers that happen along the way towards mission accomplished, many of which will fail. This is why in the entrepreneurial state, I talked also about the very important role of a portfolio mindset, right? But that's also why it becomes really important, not just to pick up the downside, but also to get a share of the upside, because you know you will fail. There'll be lots of learning by doing and trial and error. But also what's important here is to realize that in most countries, it's the opposite. Just take this figure, turn it on its head. There's many projects, even in Europe today, there's a 2 trillion next gen EU a European recovery scheme, and countries to access that scheme have to come up with projects around climate and digitalization. How easy is it to come up with projects? But if there's no mission, the sum is not greater than the parts. So missions also help to create more glue, more transformative capacity, more framing and coherence, so the sum is greater than the parts, and you don't just get lots of projects, falling on your head at the government level. And I worked very closely with the European Commission back in 2018. It was an honor that they actually listened. Often academics write stuff and no one listens, and we all yell, hey, listen. But they listened, and now there's a missions instrument in Europe, and this was some graphs I showed in the report, for example, with SDG 13 and 14, just what I meant exactly by going from a challenge, which is quite broad, to a very specific mission, like reduction of 90% of plastics in our oceans, if we want to clean up those oceans, and make sure it's intersectoral and bottom up, where some of these projects work, some don't, but that's what we're trying to fuel, lots of experimentation towards mission accomplished. They should be bold and inspirational. If you can't even remember the mission statement, it ain't gonna work. A clear direction that you can answer yes or no, cross-sectoral, and driving those bottom-up solutions. I had the honor to work with Greg Clark when he was minister at the time. The ministry was called BAYS. Since I moved to the UK, I think that department has changed name at least 5 times. And they actually listened also in those early days when I was speaking to both Greg Clark and later with David Willits. We ran actually Mission-Oriented Council, moving away from the 5 sectors, so a sector-specific industrial strategy. They were thinking about, at the time, already with Vince Cable, you'll remember, it was automobiles, life sciences, aerospace, finance, and the creative sector. And I was like, why? Those are just 5 kind of randomish sectors. Yes, they're very important, but what about all these other sectors? So I said, pick challenges and missions, not sectors, and ask what it means for all those sectors you just listed and others in order for mission accomplished. And on the back of that, they chose healthy aging, clean growth, the future of mobility. The AI data economy at the time, I thought that was a bit weird because AI and data is critical to any mission, but still, putting the UK at the forefront of AI and data revolution. This is 2018, by the way. And then again, in this mission-oriented council we set up, which I chaired in my institute, David Willits and I helped different actors in government, but also different stakeholders think about this. And you see here an example where with the Future of Mobility Challenge, looking at, for example, the different areas that would be critical to that. It's not just transport. Transport is just one sector, but also if you think of some of the projects that were needed to reach the goal, and the goal at the time was by 2040 to put the UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and emission-free zero accident systems. Just the fact that it had the word accessible meant that some of those projects might be areas like rendering the public transport system 100% accessible in terms of disability. So you require solutions to be solved in order to reach that particular mission, including in the area of disabilities. And so this obviously stimulates, by having it be cross-sectoral, it stimulates a lot of private sector solutions, working with other actors, because it's a difficult problem. It's very different from just saying, think of school lunch, right? If it's just lunch versus healthy, tasty, sustainable lunch, that's going to require lots more innovation and investment and training within the private sector to achieve that goal in working well with the public sector. And I think, coming to the current industrial strategy and what's happening in government, I think there's lots of, excellent initiatives, but one of the worries I have is that we're sort of going backwards. The current industrial strategy, notwithstanding the talk about missions, actually has kind of returned to sectors. And there are different sectors, and it's a great list. I can't say anything bad about any of these sectors, but first of all, there's some sectors that aren't here, like food, like water. But really, if we ask ourselves, what would it mean for a sustainability transition? What does it mean for, say, digital technology? What does it mean for life sciences? That's already, that challenge that missions pose is that they require sectors, different sectors in the economy, to invest and to innovate in order, again, to have the mission accomplished. So currently, of the different missions, those 5 missions that I had up there with the photograph of Keir Starmer, the net zero mission surely is, one that, sorry, it's not moving, it's maybe closer to what I mean by missions, but the fact that it's still just around energy, a bit less so. So in order to achieve a sustainability related mission, setting net zero emissions that catalyze cross-sectoral investment, innovation, and transformation across how we build, how we move, how we eat. That actually requires a lot of economic transformation, investment, and innovation that goes beyond just the energy sector. And this is the kind of work that we've been doing. I had the honor last year to co-chair the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. So Nick Stern did climate change, Dasgupta did biodiversity, and we did water. It was myself, the president of Singapore, the head of the WTO, Ngazio Conjiwila, and Johan Rockstrom. And we asked ourselves, in order to solve, for example, the global hydrological cycle, how can we use a missions approach to launch a new revolution in food systems, given that agriculture uses something like 70% of our water, conserving and restoring natural habitats. Every time we deforest, say the Amazon or any forest, we're hurting the biodiversity on the ground, which is it's a sink, it's a sponge, which then transpires and creates green water, which later turns into blue water. So we need to conserve and restore these natural habitats if we think about the water emissions, a circular water economy, so on and so forth. So missions, if done well, can again both solve big problems, but also then require lots of investment in the private sector. 80% of industrial wastewater, by the way, is not recycled, which is crazy given that it's the state that is giving companies water rights, putting in those contracts, those water right contracts, that those companies benefiting from state-given water rights have to innovate and invest towards a more sustainable planet. So at the minimum, recycling industrial wastewater is actually about stimulating an investment strategy. It's not just protecting the planet, it then requires investment and innovation. And that's the point. By having missions like cutting leakages and non-revenue water in half by 2030, it requires investment in all sorts of different sectors and those bottom-up projects. Let me speed up a bit. I think I have 5 minutes left. So what does it mean for institutions and tools? As I said, missions is about changing what we do, not old wine in new bottles. What does it mean for procurement, for public finance? What does it mean for how we do government? That interministerial approach. Where should mission boards sit? Well, ideally at the center. Otherwise, it just becomes one ministry's, if you want, mission, and then by design, it goes back to the silos at the departmental level. And I wrote a paper with the Future Governance Forum about mission boards. Just had a conversation today with the Barbados team that we've been working with about where mission boards should sit. But also really that redesign of tools. As soon as you have a mission, then something like a public bank needs to really rethink itself to provide loans to the private sector, conditional that they're really showing that they're moving towards a mission. An example would be the KfW in Germany. That's a large public bank, We know, many of us have written about this, including Will and I, there's not enough patient public finance in the UK. But even if we had patient public finance, unless it's mission aligned, it could become part of the problem. So the KfW in Germany, it was really only after the Energiewende policy was introduced around reducing carbon emissions that the loan program to sectors like the steel sector changed. So the only reason there's green steel, and steel is very important if you think about the crisis of steel in the UK and many other countries, and we need steel to build wind farms. The only reason there's green steel is that because of the Energiewende, the loan provided by the German public bank to steel was conditional that they lower the material content of production. And that's what happened throughout the whole supply chain. Not because they went to Davos to talk about purpose, but because they had to receive €1 from the German bank. And in helping to set up the Scottish National Investment Bank, which I did with Laurie McFarlane at IAPP, we again tried to help Scotland itself rethink its own pots of finance to be more patient and long-term, but also more aligned with Scotland's own missions. We also worked at a very local level with Camden Council, for example, learning from that lesson about procurement, outcomes-oriented procurement, also in a more participatory way, really bringing this notion of public value. So we worked on a project, for example, this was when Georgia Gould was still leader of Camden Council, to have an outcomes-oriented procurement process towards adult social care in Camden's housing estates, where we brought the carers and the carees to the table to actually design that outcomes-oriented adult social care procurement. And in the process, really thought a lot about how can we have metrics around public value that, again, are truly outcomes-driven, that are focused also on who will deliver it, how they will deliver it, much more dynamic in terms of those spillovers along the way. Towards mission accomplished. And a lot of this work is published. And really also looking at some of the limits of the social value framework in terms of how it was a bit too peripheral, ad hoc, and burdensome, and the strength of this public value framework that IAPP has been thinking a lot about. New social contract, ecosystems can be parasitic, they can be predator-prey, they can be mutualistic, they can be symbiotic. So what kind of partnership do we have? Is it a good partnership or a bad partnership? And this is not about being business friendly, as I said already. It's about working well with business and other actors towards actually achieving really important goals. I wrote a paper with Danny Roderick about this. We talk about it as conditionalities and reciprocity. Now that Trump uses the word reciprocity, I focus much more on the word mutualism and symbiosis. But this idea of actually putting into any contract, like the water contract I mentioned, procurement contracts. I worked with Gina Raimondo under the Biden administration. She was the Secretary of Commerce, about embedding, for example, in the CHIPS program, which was over $300 billion of grants and loans to semiconductor companies, conditions that would make sure this was a good public-private partnership. So those companies benefiting from the CHIPS Act had to commit to reinvesting their profits, not share buybacks. Very important given the $7 trillion in share buybacks we've seen in the last 10 years. Profit sharing agreements, access to childcare, improved working conditions, energy efficient supply chains. Some people might argue this was too many. I actually focused on the three: the share buybacks, energy efficiency, and working conditions. They added more things. That's going to always be the design challenge, not too much because it will become burdensome, but enough that actually makes sure you're working well together. But what you don't want is just kind of handouts for the sake of handouts. During COVID, by the way, it was very interesting. The UK government gave 600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. Whereas in France, because they were trying to really align their industry towards carbon reduction, the support given to both Renault and Air France were conditional that those companies reduce their carbon emissions. And similarly, working with ScotWind in Scotland, we've been thinking a lot about this idea of reciprocity in the contracts in the wind industry in Scotland. Participation, I already warned I wouldn't say much about. In fact, I have one slide. Go to the Camden Renewal Commission, which I co-chaired the website with Georgia Gould, to find out more how we really worked with the community, not at the community, and even transforming food banks into green food cooperatives, giving agency, dignity, value to people as part of that process. I cannot say how important this is. It's probably the most important aspect of missions, so co-creating missions. We went to the resident associations, citizen assemblies to actually talk about green growth, sustainability, and to think of what it meant for the community. Public sector capabilities, I've already said. Without this, nothing happens. Without this, we don't know how to govern. It was very interesting, actually, that the same guy in NASA who set up the procurement scheme, his name was Ernest Brackett, was the same guy that warned at the time, already in the 60s, he said that NASA wouldn't know how to work with the private sector if it continued, which it did, to outsource a lot of its knowledge. He said, ultimately, we will get captured. They didn't have PowerPoints at the time, they had brochures, shiny brochures. He said, we will get captured by brochuremanship if we don't even know how to work with the private sector, if there's all this intermediation. And in fact, that's what Lord Agnew said during COVID, where he saw how much money was being spent on Deloitte, KPMG, but also during Brexit. And he said, we're infantilizing the civil service. And this is, we had already started writing this book, but we put that subtitle there, infantilization of our governments through this consultification. But the only way to combat that is not just to say no more consultants. It's really about building within stronger public sector capabilities. And I did a study during COVID, actually, of those countries in the developing world that did better. And it was very much on the back of having invested within government, within administrative capacity to work well with others. It's always about working with others. It's never about government for the sake of government. And that includes investing in digital platforms due to the infodemic. We found that countries like Vietnam, Rwanda, Kerala, and India did better than other developing countries on the back of having actually invested in those capacities. We currently in the Institute have a project with Bloomberg Philanthropies trying to actually map what these public sector capabilities are. And this is very much on the back of the work we're doing with others. And lastly, just to say there's a real global agenda around this. We shouldn't forget that in a moment of such geopolitical distress and the failure of multilateralism, there are actually leaders out there. Three in particular I'd like to point to: the president of South Africa, the president of Brazil, and the president of Spain, who are each hosting this year conferences that are about multilateralism, and I would argue around missions. So the COP conference hosted by Brazil, the South Africa G20, and Sanchez is hosting in Seville the Financing for Development. And this idea that ultimately the biggest missions are global. We can't have climate nationalism like we couldn't have vaccine nationalism. And using these events and these conferences and what the leaders are saying to also hold the system accountable, that we really recognize that many of our problems are global in nature. On that, I will stop because I think I'm going beyond my time, but just to say, please do get in touch. The Institute at UCL, we think a lot about this on the theory front, on the teaching front, on the policy front. We also have applied learning programs. But anyway, thank you so much and happy to take questions.
Well, Mariana, tour de force, brilliant. Brilliant. There's a few questions already come up on the Q&A, which I will kind of throw your way in a second. But one question I just wanted to, a kind of big question, it occurred to me as you were speaking. There's so much actually. But I was thinking about Britain's low investment and low productivity record in the context of, missions being and the working across sectors and problem solving, being a way of identifying things that need to happen, need to innovate for, need to invest for. And actually, as a kind of country, we've lost our way and our sense of mission. And very few kind of companies are mission driven, except in the private markets. Interestingly enough, often venture backed, which is another dimension, by the way. There's part of the financial system which is quite creative, alongside the rent-seeking financial system you've kind of portrayed so brilliantly. I mean, as I say that, what are you thinking? Are you thinking, yeah, Will's onto something, or I thought of that myself, or I want to develop it, or?
Well, first, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, I think it's really hard for governments to think in terms of the long term when there's so many pressures in the short term, whether it's the bond market pressures or the next electoral cycle. So that's why my own first interest in missions was about the design of organizations. Like, how do we make sure that the short-termism, which is not just in the private sector, but also in the public sector due to different reasons, the electoral cycle and so on, how do we actually build mission-driven organizations? And that's why back in 2014, I organized a conference on mission-oriented organizations and financial institutions. And I brought people in like the head of not just DARPA, but at the time ARPA-E, so the same thing as DARPA, but for energy. Her name was Cheryl Martin. I said, how do you even like, what's the culture that you even try to embed in the institution? And she said, well, we actually measure our success by how much risk we were willing to take, and how much kind of economy-wide success our few successes have. In other words, we recognize that we need that trial and error and experimentation kind of culture within. If people are just trying to do the easy stuff, it will be impossible to be mission driven. And second, we need to make sure they're not just tinkering with little solutions to little problems. Remember Keynes's quote, the point of the public sector is not just to do, how do you say, just to make things a bit better, a bit worse, but to really do what's not being done at all. So how do we frame that what's not being done at all? What are those objectives to those problems? And how do we make sure that those solutions have kind of economy-wide potential transformation? And it was just interesting that she talked about it that way, because it meant that she saw the main thing about missions as a cultural change within government institutions. So it's not just about, is there a vision or not, as you mentioned, in government, but do we even have the culture of experimentation, hence also the capacity and capability point. And ultimately, that's about training. It really is a new curriculum. That's why I set up the Institute. I believe we need a different curriculum from the current one that is currently being taught in MPA programs, which is still about public choice theory, new public management, fearing, government failure almost more than market failure. So a lot of that, I think, has to change, as much as saying that our leaders need vision. But even if you have a vision, if we then don't have that culture of experimentation within, then you can't even do the outcomes-oriented procurement. And lastly, just your point about venture capital, you'll know that I wrote a whole book about, the entrepreneurial state and the myths behind venture capital. So I don't think it's just about, the Goldman Sachs problem. When you have exit-driven finance, where venture capital wants to exit in 3 or 5 years through an IPO or in a buyout, that has ended up in many different sectors, including biotech, rushing the scientific process, and we end up having PLIPOs, productless IPOs. Bill Izonik and I wrote about that. It's not true across the whole venture capital sector, but it does mean that we should always say, what is the problem and what form of finance is required? And let's look at the problems with the current forms of finance instead of just using the word finance to solve a problem. So the form of finance is what becomes important. The mission, long-term committed strategic finance, is what the UK has very little of.
So many questions here which are really fascinating. I mean, one that that kind of flows on from that really, which is I was in a room recently with a venture capitalist and someone speaking with the government, and he was the governmental person, was saying, he says, hopeless, we've too many tax incentives for seed investment in enterprise investment scheme. We're getting 6,000-7,000 startups a year. We need to really kind of rein that back. To which the venture capitalist said, "You don't get it. I mean, there's only 1% of that 6,000 that will come through as winners. And if you cut that ratio, we're going to get less winners." You saw
Yes.
I mean, you saw the two kind of cultures really kind of facing off against each other, where actually, I agree with you about venture capital, by the way, although I do think it's got many virtues.
Of
But
course.
I think that mindset of actually recognizing that actually for every one thing you go for, you're going to have 2, 3, 4, 5 losers is fundamental.
But that's why you also need to structure the deals right. So the example I always give is Tesla. So the US government, while in the UK and the EU we were doing austerity, the US woke up and had an 800 billion stimulus program after the financial crisis. Part of that was through guaranteed loans to the private sector through a portfolio approach, knowing that win some, lose some. So they lost with Solyndra, they won with Tesla. But did they actually win, right? So Solyndra and Tesla were part of the same portfolio. They each got between 460 and 500 million in a guaranteed loan. It wasn't enough to say win some, lose some. They should have structured the deal so the government actually socialized not just the risks, but also the rewards. Instead, they said to Tesla, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. Of course, they did pay back the loan. The price per share went from 9 to 90. And had they said, if you do pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares, not nationalization, just smart governance, then that difference, 90 minus 9 multiplied by 3 million, would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investments. So one thing is to say win some, lose some, as you just said. Another thing is to admit that for the public sector, they should also do what the private VC industry does, which is to structure it as a portfolio and don't just pick up the downside. The public sector always picking up the downside, get a share of the upside.
I
And
strongly
that's what I
agree.
really don't see happening almost at all in any modern Western government.
Um, a couple of questions really here, but essentially they boil down to is there what hope do you see? Um, I'm aligning a couple of questions actually from the questioners. What hope do you see, if any? Uh, 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 are you more hopeful or are you pessimistic about the government's line on its missions? I mean, there's certainly not much of the thinking that you've kind of
Mm,
outlined this afternoon, and it's in where it's got to. I mean, are there
yeah.
any possibilities that the growth it wants so ardently will emerge from what it's doing?
So, I mean, let me just be quick about this so we can get also more questions. First is I definitely think we need a change to the fiscal rules. And myself and others wrote a letter to the FT in the autumn, in September. And I think Rachel Reeves, the chancellor, listened. She changed the fiscal rules a bit, but I think we need actually a bit more of a drastic overhaul. Even the IMF and the World Bank have been suggesting this, interestingly, for the UK and not for developing countries, so a bit hypocritical. But in order to have the kind of public investment we need to both fix an infrastructure problem, but also to crowd in the private sector, which, as I mentioned, is not investing enough in the UK. We have to know how to evaluate that public sector investment, which current fiscal rules don't allow us to do because of how they're structured. So that's a first huge challenge. Without that, it's going to be hard. Second, actually, ironically, then for defense, as we're seeing in the UK, but also in Germany, those two first slides I had, which showed this kind of dichotomous thing of, is it climate or is it growth? Of course, it's both if you do it properly. But in both countries, it's interesting that whereas climate got a bit of pushback, then all of a sudden for defense, money comes out of thin air, right? And it always comes out of the woodwork. Has any war ever happened and a government said, oh, there's no money? For war, somehow money appears. So what we need to remember also is if we do any mission well, and this is what's interesting, is that wartime missions tend to be done pretty well because people want to win the war. And so they structure the investments like advanced purchasing agreements, proper contracts. When the military invests in health because soldiers get sick, they always negotiate properly with pharmaceutical companies on patents and so on, whereas the health departments tend not to do that. But we have to remember that, ultimately, this is about structuring missions that fuel growth. And that's my second sort of critique, which is that growth is not the mission. Missions have to be around health, around digital divide, net zero. And currently, only the net zero one, I think, is framed as a mission that can catalyze that cross-sectoral investment, but it's mainly around energy. And my suggestion would be to make sure, and I think Ed Miliband totally gets this, that it's truly a sustainability mission that requires, for example, the steel sector in the UK to innovate to lower its carbon and material composition, like happened in Germany. And so that would be sort of a challenge. I do think there's people like Georgia Gould, who's now left being Camden leader. She's in the cabinet office in charge of different aspects of public sector reform and innovation, who I have lots of faith in because I saw how she worked in Camden. But she needs to have not just a position, but we need her kind of thinking to really be
Yeah.
kind of across government. So outcomes oriented procurement is for every single sector. Just think of the innovation budget in the UK. At the time, it was only 10 billion when I was working with Greg Clark. Just the procurement budget of the Ministry of Transport was 40 billion. So if you start having a sustainable mobility mission, then the procurement budget of a Ministry of Transport becomes part of your innovation budget because the goal being set becomes ambitious. And that's what I think is possible. Whether we're going to get that in the UK, we'll see.
And now that's interesting because you picked up this a sustainable mobility kind of
Yeah.
mission is an example you've given, where others are asking kind of
Mm.
what missions do you have in mind? What scale do they have to be? Others are asking kind of other should well-being be part of a mission? How would you fit that in? You is to
Mm.
in a
Of
context
course.
you talk growth. I mean,
Yeah.
there's all this other kind of dimension to growth. So there's
Yeah.
those kind of not. I mean, I mean, they're endorsing your kind of line of thinking, but just want to, I guess, how can it be shaped to accommodate those kind of points?
So, I mean, that is the whole point, and perhaps I wasn't clear. The whole point is countries should be thinking of the challenges, for example, around health, for example, around well-being, even a city around knife crime. Think of the knife crime epidemic in London. It's not going to be solved by one ministry. You absolutely need a cross-ministerial approach to a problem like having a zero knife crime epidemic amongst teenagers. Which is a problem that's very dear to me because of what's been happening in my own community in Camden. That by design, if you're going to take it seriously, requires that cross-departmental kind of thinking. But I worked very closely with Sweden, for example, but also Brazil and Camden and so on these well-being type missions in Sweden. And by the way, my role is not to tell governments what their missions are. It's to say, hey, formulate within your country and at the community level, think about what your challenges are. You tell me what they are, transform them into missions that require cross-sectoral and bottom-up. But in Sweden, for example, they had a high-level challenge of a fossil-free welfare state. And that meant that then they, with the work they did with us, it meant that then if you brought it down to the everyday kind of operations of government, it meant that the Department of Education had to rethink its school meal policy. And instead of it, as I mentioned before, just being lunch and cheap lunch, keeping the costs low, it became a moonshot itself. So lunch had to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. So it was a sub-mission within the grander plan of a fossil-free welfare state, and that required a very different relationship between the government and its procurement policy for lunch in schools, where they were thinking about poverty, making sure that every child had access to a free lunch, but a good lunch, and to make sure it was healthy, tasty, and sustainable, the companies benefiting from that contract were not only local, because they wanted local suppliers and not large Sodexo-like multinational corporations supplying lunch, but also that they had to innovate. And by the way, if they're small, then they need extra support. But you don't just think of a small, medium enterprise strategy, SME strategy. You think of what your missions are, and then you help your small companies work towards that mission, but that's only if they're willing. So that moves you away from a picking winners to a picking the willing mentality. But that itself, something as simple as lunch, like what's more normal than lunch, going from a moonshot to lunch, as long as it's an innovative criteria, it will then require investment, innovation. Lo and behold, it causes productivity and growth. What is growth? It's an outcome of investment. And low productive economies like the UK economies tend to be low growth economies. And it's not a coincidence that they also tend to be economies where there's not enough vision of where do we even want to go. So there's not enough demand on the private sector to move in that direction. And you end up just getting subsidies and guarantees for standing still.
There's one very similar question. Where does the entrepreneur fit in?
Well, the whole point is entrepreneurship. So my work, as you know, from the entrepreneurial state was about let's stop obsessing about the entrepreneur as though it's one person or one type of actor and look at the entrepreneurial system, which includes entrepreneurship within government in terms of welcoming that uncertainty. Entrepreneurship ultimately is about welcoming uncertainty and creating markets. And so I believe in an entrepreneurial system requires an entrepreneurial also civil service, but then helping the private sector scale and create markets. That's why procurement is so interesting. It's a demand side tool, which if accompanied by supply side loans, for example, to small companies and startups, that's not going to be enough. They won't be able to scale. They won't have a market. And if you look at the success of the US military industrial complex, and that's the pity, it's only in the military we see this, not enough in health, not enough in energy, is they use demand side tools to allow the small companies then to grow. And the irony is that in Europe and in the UK, we always say, oh, these companies are going to the US because somehow there's more of a culture of risk taking. No, they actually have the tools. And you see this through all the different public institutions across the whole innovation chain that have actually helped small companies then scale and grow due to these market creation tools. And that's alongside, of course, the venture capital that you rightly mentioned is very important as long as it's not short-term exit-driven VC.
Um, Number of questioners have asked, you know, um, where effectively have citizens managed to be engaged in this process in the way that
Mm.
you call for? And others have asked, you've worked with a number of governments. Is there a particular example of something she's really you're really proud of, or that's really worked, and how many of them
Yeah.
have come to fruition, and how and I mean you've been tireless and energetic and won prizes for your work, but I mean how widespread is the knowledge, even
Mm.
within governments highly committed to missions, of what governments are doing? It's I mean
Yeah.
there's a bunch of questions there really.
Well, they're great questions. And again, it's literally why I have a bit of a headache, which is instead of just writing books and flying in and flying out and talking about my own stuff, I've set up a whole institute, which is about training up the civil service. Presidents, prime ministers come and go, ministers come and go, the civil service stays. So one thing is spreading the knowledge within the civil service, rethinking its role as co-creating value, not just redistributing, enabling, facilitating, de-risking, all these incredibly boring words. That's one thing. Spreading the knowledge through education, because I do think we need a new way of thinking. But also, I mean, this is one of the reports I was most proud of. We worked with the Brazilian government. This is the Portuguese version, Transformação do Estado no Brasil. We worked on procurement, digital governance, and state-owned enterprises on how they have to transform in order to actually reach goals. Otherwise, they're part of the problem. Italy, my country, born in Italy, I have UK citizenship and Italian citizenship. Our public bank is part of the problem. It just gives out money to any sector that screams for help. Why should they be helped? What if maybe they're going down because they haven't invested enough, haven't innovated enough, haven't treated their workers too well? How do we make sure that public loan programs are not just patient and long-term, very important, but also helping transformation, like transformative capacity, structural change, development processes, instead of just saving companies after they themselves have not done much. And so that idea of learning from lessons, what works, what doesn't, in Corfo in Chile, it was really interesting. We worked with them on also learning in a public lab kind of way. They actually have in Chile a laboratorio de gobierno, a public lab within government, across departments, testing these different ideas. Ultimately, the point of testing and learning from different experiences is to then share that knowledge. And yes, I don't think I'm alone, but it does feel a bit lonely in this era of kind of chainsaws, Milei, Elon Musk, but also some of the narrative that we've heard even by progressive governments about the civil service being inefficient. Well, why are they inefficient? It's going to be very hard to change that unless we, again, change the fiscal rules. We change the idea from lender of last resort to investor of first resort, portfolio thinking, investing in public labs, deconsultifying our government, so on and so forth.
We're into the last kind of minute, really, of before we promised we will finish it at 6. And and I'm just wondering if whether you kind of summed it up there, really. Have another minute before we have to sign off.
Mm.
I mean, um, is there an exemplar is there something that you're really proud of where you feel um, this is it? I've got as near
Mm.
for all its imperfections, this project, this government, this approach has worked. It could be South
Mm.
Korea, it could be Switzerland, it could be Mexico, wherever it is. I don't know. It
Yeah.
must be a subset.
Um,
Is there an area where you feel, yeah, you can point people towards and say, this is where I think I've got more right than wrong.
It's a great question. And my first answer usually is no, because I don't think of governments or countries. I think of experiences in particular organizations. A lot of the examples I gave were actually of a particular, say, public bank, or in the UK, even with all the problems we've had, I think GDS, Government Digital Services, especially when it was run by Mike Bracken. It's so interesting how they thought about their own role in the economy and digital governance in order to help actually ministries work together better. That didn't necessarily happen, but that was their goal. And so it's not surprising that I invited Mike Bracken to be part of the Institute to help us on that. But there was lots of lessons on that particular organization, lessons in the BBC. We worked with the BBC on their whole notion of public value and how they themselves were very different from other public broadcasters globally. So one part of the answer is there's no one country that gets it right. There's lots of organizations that we can learn from. But I would say that Barbados, which is the country I've worked with probably the most in the last 2 years, because the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, is absolutely phenomenal, has been a country where I've really learned a lot. Why? Because they didn't just set these amazing 6 missions. They also brought what they call the social partnership to the table. And that idea of not only doing it with citizens, but also with, really all the stakeholders. You yourself, Will, have been absolutely phenomenal in writing about stakeholder capitalism. They brought trade unions to the table, different citizen groups, different business groups, different government groups, and made it a contested. I mean, I sat in those meetings and I can tell you it was very contested. And I've just learned a lot through that social partnership role. And we're actually writing now, after this report, which was a mission-oriented strategy for inclusive and sustainable economic growth in Barbados, which the Prime Minister herself, you can see her here, wrote the forward for. We now actually have a report on the lessons we've learned during the last 2 years, including how to set up mission boards that are not siloed, the issues around the social partnership, but also really getting citizens who, in a country that has experienced slavery, people need to feel valued. They need to genuinely be part of, not in a tokenistic way, but part of that mission design process. And that, I think, is a really important lesson also for Camden.
So from Camden to Barbados,
And back.
and you've and back. Well, you've done very, very well, and you've survived that kind of a well-known kind of complaint.
From Mexico. Yeah, I said I have Montezuma's revenge for everyone in case you want to know what we're talking. Just came back from Mexico last night, but hey, I guess I'm getting better.
It's a fantastic lecture. Thank you very much. Well, it's been recorded. Will be available on our website. And thank you so much. Is there one, just before I feel there should be some kind of one last kind of emphatic
Hmm.
20 or 30 seconds from you to as you bow out. Social
Just that,
science.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
social science. Well, two things. One is we cannot waste this opportunity, both in the UK, where we have a government which is, I think, genuinely trying to be progressive. Let's really make this idea of a mission-oriented government a serious occasion to change, as I mentioned, a lot of issues around, problematic public-private partnerships that couldn't have been more problematic, actually, in the UK, turn them into really good reciprocity, symbiotic, mutualistic partnerships towards solving the problems that people actually care about. Think of water in, sewage in our waterways. Why is that? That's also a corporate governance issue, and that's related to missions. But the other thing is social sciences. What we don't want is technocratic missions. Why did Roosevelt, during the recovery after the great crash, he brought artists, he brought designers. There was the Bauhaus movement also, back in Europe. This idea of also bringing a notion of beauty, of poetry, of culture. It's important to reimagine what kind of society do we even want? And humanities and social science have always been very important in terms of playing that critical eye, right? Like, what kind of society do we want to live in? That's the first question. After we answer that question, we need to be asking ourselves, what might different missions be that will help us actually create that kind of society? And using those missions and putting them at the center of an economic growth policy instead of far away from the chancellor is absolutely essential. And I would really welcome if the current chancellor and the UK government embrace this approach.
The first challenge to raise your ease, direct one. Okay. Mariana, thank you very much. We'll let you get on with your writing, with your important work from recovering from your last trip.
Thank you.
Great good fortune in the next 6 months with the G20, climate change, man navigating Donald Trump, etc., etc. We need you here at home a bit too. So, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And
Thank you so much.
what
It's
can
been
I
a
say?
pleasure.